I realized not too long ago that I never really formalized my process for development, for talking about releases or sprints and the idea of iteration. And so I wanted to make sure that I was being very transparent about how it is that we're developing learning links, how it is that we're gathering requirements and talking through iteration as a process in relationship to a more traditional waterfall model and thinking through what the implications there are. So I wanted to take a look at a couple of different ideas, which are not mine, but are actually from the Agile framework, of which there are many different facets. So I wanted to talk through a couple of pieces of data, then talk through the process and things like that. So the track record for IT projects in general, all development projects and things like that, 2/3 of IT projects are challenged. This is from the Standish Group Chaos Reports. Over budget by about 189%, over schedule by 220%. Only 61% of features end up being delivered in a final product. 66% of projects fail or are marginal. And so if you think about very specific cost overruns and things like that, from Hewlett Packard, 160 million lost because of ERP system problems, 527 million written off because of supply chain system that was developed and then abandoned. So the idea that a project that doesn't end up meeting the requirements by the end of it, even though it might meet the original requirements, but it doesn't meet the current need, ends up being quite wasteful in terms of what we've done and things like that. And that's obviously something that we want to avoid: poor quality, slow to deliver, and also being expensive as well. So what we want is something that's better, faster, and cheaper. So before we take a look at what better, faster, and cheaper might look like, let's look at a typical software development process that follows the waterfall model. You start with requirements gathering, then you go to design, implementation, testing, deployment, and maintenance. And that's pretty much the most basic waterfall model. So one thing that ends up happening is you have a lot of changes to your requirements over time, and especially as you start to gather more requirements from different stakeholder groups and things like that. The design and implementation end up taking too long, so you end up skipping the testing, which is really where users get to access the tool and things like that, whatever it is that you're building. And then you end up dreading the deployment and maintenance process, because that is where sort of the rubber meets the road, and you don't end up getting a lot of time to ask questions. You end up just saying go. And so that becomes slightly problematic, and I'd like to talk about what the alternative is. And so rather than doing this upfront requirements gathering that has sort of very large implications for the entire process of developing the tool, we think about the product, right? The product as a finished entity is described as a list of features, or the backlog. And the backlog typically looks like something very specific. So different pieces of functionality that we want, and they are described in terms of user stories. So those could be from an end user, those could be from an internal user, but it's always somebody doing something. So somebody needs to be able to do something within the system, and we build functionality towards that user story. The Scrum team, which is a model of Agile development, estimates. So basically the team that's in charge of the project estimates the work associated with each story, not the entire project, but each story. And the features in the backlog are then ranked in order of importance. So we're doing some prioritization there, and then the result is a ranked and weighted list of product features, what a lot of people call the roadmap. Okay. And so basically the product owner owns the product backlog. So all of those user stories, that product owner, whoever is sort of the project manager and those kinds of things, would own that product backlog, and then leading it to prototyping. So prototype ends up leading to a product. It provides us with rapid feedback, this iterative process, which we'll talk about, and reducing risk because we're just talking about individual user stories that we'll put into production and then move forward. Because we're not going after the whole thing, we're going after small chunks. Each iteration is generally called a release or a sprint, and it's from 2 to 4 weeks. And so the process, what you're looking at over here, the product backlog itself is all of the user stories. The sprint backlog is a subset of that. What are we going to tackle for these 2 weeks? So we're going to do that in an iterative cycle, a daily or every few day sprint meeting to discuss what have we done, what are we currently working on, what roadblocks do we have, and then at the end of the sprint we actually have a deliverable. So the idea is that we're saying at the end of this sprint users will be able to do X. Each sprint has a specific, measurable, and attainable goal. We can even put number of hours, price on that, everything like that, and it allows us to keep cost overruns in check. This sprint ends up starting with a planning meeting and then ends with a retrospective, usually a demo, a way of showing the progress that has been made. At the planning meeting, we can commit to an amount of work. This is not what we hope to do. This is not what we're planning to do. It is what we commit to do as a part of that planning meeting. And so by doing this, by going through this process, I want to take a look at why this is better. Why would this work not only as a conceptual level, but in terms of strict numbers? So this is some data that has been gathered specifically for pitting agile processes versus traditional or waterfall models. And so in terms of project success rates, and that's defined specifically as achieving the goals of that particular project, releasing on time, releasing on budget, those kinds of things. Agile ends up sort of besting the traditional models. We get here our sort of productivity measures, quality, cost of system development, and business stakeholder satisfaction. So what we end up doing, and this is in relationship, so Agile software development compared with traditional approaches. And you notice that somewhat higher or much higher is the largest area of productivity, quality, business stakeholder satisfaction, and cost of the system development. So that's always important to note. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? There are a couple of different terms here that all speak to an agile methodology. Iterative, agile, and lean are all very similar. And the idea is that by doing an iterative process based upon a backlog, we're able to develop in a much more successful manner. And then what we get is we're taking a look at the project success rates by team size. This isn't as important because we have small teams, but it's important to think about it does scale. And it's not just for small projects, it can be for large scale projects where we're constantly delivering on the objectives of an individual sprint rather than an entire project. And then when we look at sort of that overall success and distribution by geographic teams, so thinking through, does this work because we are in Denver and other folks on the team would be in Dayton, and taking a look at the statistics on that. So that's important to point out that it does work, as iterative and agile models are very successful at pulling teams together because we do have that constant conversation and communication about what we're doing during that individual sprint. And then thinking through the cost of change. We end up changing our minds and our product many times throughout the iterative process, but if we've committed to everything rather than small changes, the cost of change goes up a lot, exponentially, which is why this growth curve is an exponential curve. So hopefully this makes a lot of sense in terms of why we do what we do and why we communicate the way in which we do through video, through daily stand-ups, those kinds of things. And we'd love to become even more transparent about that. But thank you for watching, and please let us know if you have questions about how we're actually managing all of the technology and the process.